I was waiting for it to work. Hi, Christine Weber here. Did not get to do my weekly live stream this week on Wednesday because I was at a conference, which I'll tell you about in a moment. But this is my weekly live stream, and I love to help. I love to support mature yoga teachers and their path and getting their wisdom out to the world. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some sequencing tips, and sort of my favorite sequencing tip is do not start your classes with seated forward bends. People often look at me and they're like, "What are you talking about?" Of course, you should start with seated. You want to start your class slowly, and people have been sitting, and so you should just sit down, do some poses, get up, and no, there's and I'll tell you why in a moment. There's nothing wrong, by the way, with with starting your class seated. I do it all the time. I like it. You sit down and you have this sort of warm feeling with everybody, and you're talking, and so like, hey, let's do some centering breath. Fantastic, do it. Let's do inhale, arms up and lengthen the spine. Wonderful. Little tiny twist, little tiny lateral bend, but not big ones. And the reason is that sitting is the new smoking, right? You've heard that. The reason is, and why? Because well, there's a lot of reasons, but the main biomechanical reason is your lumbar spine right here, these five big vertebra in the low back. When you sit, they're compressed, right? Now, when I'm standing, that weight from my lumbar spine from all of this is getting distributed into my legs. But when I'm sitting, it's not. When I'm sitting, that weight is going boom right there into, particularly where the lumbar meets the pelvis. But those five vertebrae are taking a lot of pressure. And then you start going like, let's do a big lateral, but or let's do a big forward bend, and you're increasing the pressure. There's research on this of how the spine is impacted. Like there's actually people that have measured the weight that goes into the spine, and it increases when you're sitting and you're bending forward. So another thing, if you're teaching chair yoga classes and you're like, okay, everybody, let's start our chair, which by the way, you see this all the time. You see it all the time, and people are teaching it. Let's reach down to the floor. Don't do that in the beginning of your chair class. And for many people, they don't need to do it at all. It's not necessarily the best way of bending forward. You have the weight is distributed in the legs, right? So then I do this kind of a forward bend. It's actually a lot safer than sitting in a chair or sitting on the floor and doing a forward bend because of the weight in the lumbar spine. So that doesn't mean that it's going to hurt people necessarily. But it also means like we should at least know that. We should at least know it so that we can be more intentional about the way we sequence. Now, when you are ready to do guess what prepares you for doing all those seated forward bends, by the way? Standing poses, which is why many of you have heard this story. Like if you look in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika or the Garanda Samhita or the Shiva Samhita, the older texts, some of them are not that old, but they're at least like 300 years, 200, 300 years old. Hatha Yoga Pradipika is like at least 800 years old, maybe a little older. Anyway, you look at those texts, and most of the poses are like shoulder stand and seated forward bend and stuff. Those were the poses. And they may have been appropriate at a time when human beings were squatting a lot, not sitting in chair. In Indian culture, like chairs weren't a thing. People did a lot of squatting and sitting. So, but standing too. So there was just more mobility and more and less. Probably people weren't living as long too, but less risk in those kinds of practices. When Iyengar and Krishnamacharya came along, they started teaching standing poses. Some of those standing poses might be old and some of them are not, but it was a great innovation anyway, because the standing poses help you to prepare for the seated poses, right? So if you want to do a seated forward bend, you want to make sure you have a standing forward bend in your sequence, and a asymmetrical standing forward bend is going to be really good too, right? So that's like You could use Parshvottanasana if you like, or asymmetrical standing forward bends. So you want to make sure that you have some of these forward bends in your standing sequence, and then back bends are going to actually help your forward bends. So you have some cobra in your sequence, you have some warrior one in your sequence, some maybe a little vajrasana lightning pose when you're on your knees, or a little um, camel pose with your hands on your back. Some people can reach their heels, no problem. You have a little bit of back bends because that's going to help you get into your seated forward bends too. And you put your seated forward bends at the end of your practice, which is where they really mean to be anyway, because the seated forward bends are going to help to down regulate the sympathetic part of the nervous system and get you into more of that like peaceful state so you can have a nice long shavasana, rest your body. God knows we all need it. And then you can go on with whatever you're doing in your day. So put your seated forward bends towards the end of practice. Sitting is the new smoking. There's a load in your spine when you are sitting, and we have to be aware of that because that is a way to make sure that you're getting the most out of your practice. It's not that it's necessarily dangerous or anything. I don't want to use that kind of language, but I also think it makes sense to have a logic to your sequence. A lot of people will say to me, "Oh, I want my sequences to be really intuitive and I just like to flow." And intuition is fantastic. I would never want to quash that in somebody. And when your intuition is informed by logic, it's so much better. You'll have this much, much better experience. I went to a gentle yoga class this week at a very famous institution, very famous yoga place. And the class was lovely. The teacher was lovely. She did all sorts of lovely movements. But I couldn't help thinking if she had the logic of this way of knowing of sequencing that I learned from Gary Kraftso, from my other teachers, and I've learned from my experience over many, many years of teaching and training teachers. If she had had that, the class would have been so much more profound. You would come away with with a sense that something was really different instead of just coming away with like, oh, that was a nice stretch, which is how I felt. I was like, oh, that she's lovely. The class was lovely. I felt nicely stretched. But what if there could be more impact, And that's what sequencing does for you. That's why I'm so passionate about sequencing. I love sequencing for the nervous system so that you create emotional effects. I love the biomechanics of sequencing because it just changes everything. So if you're interested, please check out the link I put in the a description here about sequencing for nervous system that I'll be teaching tomorrow. I hope that you'll get some great tips out of it. I know you'll get some great tips out of it, and I hope it will give you this sort of revelatory experience about how sequencing can change everything in your teaching. So thank you so much for being here. Lots of love to you, and I'll see you next week on Wednesday, not Friday. Bye.